Cleopatra initiated Caesar in the most decadent revelries, presenting herself as the incarnation of the Egyptian exotic. His life with her was a constant game, as challenging as warfare. For the moment he felt secure with her, she would suddenly turn cold or angry, and he would have to find a way to regain her favor. Hello and welcome to the Papyrus Pundit podcast. This is the very first episode, and it's going to be about Cleopatra. Let's jump right into it. I'm going to be reading from The Art of Seduction by Robert Greene, the very first chapter, which is all about the seductive power of the female siren, and the example that Robert Greene, the author, uses is Cleopatra. There's a couple things you're going to find out about Cleopatra on this episode and in this book that I don't think you'll really find out about her if you're reading a more traditional biography, for instance, the Cleopatra biography by Stacy Schiff, or the book When Women Ruled the World by Kara Cooney. This is a very different biography. It's actually only a 2-page biography, so it's pretty short. Cleopatra, of course, the final pharaoh of ancient Egypt. She's not a native pharaoh, but she is the last independent ruler. So for instance, it says right here, Cleopatra the 7th, last independent ruler of Egypt. She's not a legitimate pharaoh in our traditional sense, but she is recognized as basically the last pharaoh, and Robert Greene uses her as an example in his book, mostly to talk about her sexuality, how she was able to exert enormous amounts of control over men, over the Roman generals of the period, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, who you can see there from the Elizabeth Taylor version of the Cleopatra film starring Elizabeth Taylor. I'm going to read from the book in a moment, but maybe I should just do a quick context history lesson. Cleopatra, as I said, at the tail end of Egyptian history. Here you have the Rosetta Stone, also basically at the tail end. Egypt has fallen under the rule of foreigners like the Persians and then the Ptolemaic Greeks. The native Egyptians are not in control of their own country for a very, very long time, almost 1,000 years. Mostly when we talk about ancient Egypt, we're talking about Ramses the Great. We're talking about the 1200s, the 1300s, and the 1400s. That's the new kingdom right here. This is the new kingdom. We're talking about the 18th dynasty, the 19th dynasty. Or we're talking about the period of actual pyramid building during the Old Kingdom of Egypt, which is significantly older, more than 1,000 years before the New Kingdom. But as I said, just for context, Cleopatra, she's all the way at the tail end. Cleopatra, the spectacular siren. In the year 48 BC, Ptolemy XIV of Egypt managed to depose and exile his sister and wife, Queen Cleopatra. He secured the borders against her return and began to rule on his own. Later that year, Julius Caesar came to Alexandria to ensure that despite the local power struggles, Egypt would remain loyal to Rome. Okay, so quick history lesson, 48 BC. This is 18 years before Cleopatra commits suicide by having a viper bite her flesh. This is Ptolemy XIV, which is Cleopatra's brother, but also her husband. They arrange these incestuous marriages for reasons that are actually not fully understood, but traditionally there's this idea that you need to marry in the family to keep the money in the family, to keep the wealth, the assets in the family. Obviously, if she marries someone from another family, then a portion of the royal family's assets will have to be transferred. It will be expensive, and the power of that family will be diffused. Also, it would involve their family in deeply involve them in the games of other families, which is not necessarily good. There are other reasons, one of which is more mythological, which is sort of about how different Egyptian gods are marrying brother to sister, and therefore it's expected that members of the royal family should also, in the case of kings and their sisters, should also marry brother to sister. But this may be a kind of backwards justification. I've encountered different arguments arguing it both ways, so I'm going to leave it at that. So yeah, it's 48 BC. Ptolemy XIV of Egypt has deposed Cleopatra. She is a bit older than her, if I recall. She's a lot older. She's like, 18 or something at the time, I want to say. And he's, in his young teens, or he's, a tween. He's probably being controlled by other people, other power players, and that's sort of how he's portrayed in popular media, like in HBO's Rome. If you ever watch that one, it's pretty good. He's like a kid being controlled by his counselors. Julius Caesar comes to Alexandria, and if I recall, he's chasing Pompey, his enemy. But in any case, Julius Caesar arrives in Alexandria. And one night, Caesar is meeting with his generals in the Egyptian palace, discussing strategy, when a guard enters to report that a Greek merchant has been at the door and is bearing a large and valuable gift for the Roman leader. So, in ancient times, the giving of gifts, it's only in the modern times that I feel like gift giving has gone by the wayside, but it's pretty normative. Caesar, in the mood for a little fun, gave the merchant permission to enter. The man came in, carrying on his shoulders a large rolled-up carpet. He undid the rope around the bundle, and with a snap of his wrists, unfurled it, revealing the young Cleopatra, who had been hidden inside the rug, and who rose up half-clothed before Caesar and his guests, like Venus emerging from the waves. So Venus, the Roman goddess of beauty, and basically what Robert Greene is doing here by saying that Cleopatra is Venus, other than to just say that she is beautiful, he is saying that she carries the visage of a siren, of a woman that is completely and utterly entrancing to a man. There's this saying, sometimes when a man sees a beautiful woman, that he is seeing Venus as he's not seeing the individual female before his eyes, he is actually seeing the goddess Venus. So he's entranced by beauty and unable to really see things for what they actually are. And certainly I think it's the case with Caesar that he is seeing Cleopatra as the most beautiful siren visage before his eyes, and he's not really seeing her for what she actually is, which is a powerless woman, a woman who's on her last rope, last thread, who's in a very sticky situation. She's been deposed by her brother. She's on the run, essentially. She's snuck into Alexandria. If she were caught by the city's guards, she would be killed, or arrested. So she's not in a strong position. Cleopatra is actually in a very weak position politically, strategically, etc. But in terms of her allure, in terms of her ability to very suddenly take over the room with all these Roman generals, she's suddenly just almost by magic, is basically in the strongest of positions. Let me jump back and actually read you Robert Greene's definition of what a siren is. The siren. A man is often secretly oppressed by the role he has to play, by always having to be responsible, in control, and rational. The siren is the ultimate male fantasy figure because she offers a total release from the limitations of his life. In her presence, which is always heightened and sexually charged, the male feels transported to a world of pure pleasure. She is dangerous, and in pursuing her energetically, the man can lose control over himself, something he yearns to do, perhaps secretly yearns to do. The siren is a mirage. She lures men by cultivating a particular appearance and manner. In a world where women are often too timid to project such an image, women can take control. They can learn to take control of this male libido by embodying his fantasy, his fantasy of Venus. I'm adding a little bit to the definition, but you get my point. I am reminded of, immediately when I read the word siren, I think of the Odyssey, Odysseus sailing with his sailors, returning home after the war, after the Trojan War. And of course, Robert Greene knew that you would have this desire to read that passage from the Odyssey, so he includes it on the sidebar of the book, which I'll actually read aloud. In the meantime, our good ship, with the perfect wind to drive her, fast approached the Sirens' Isle. So this is a passage from the Odyssey by Homer. But now the breeze dropped, some power lulled the waves, and a breathless calm set in. Rising from their seats, my men drew in the sail and threw it into the hold, then sat down at the oars and churned the water white with their blades of polished pine. Meanwhile I took a large round of wax, cut it up small with my sword, and kneaded the pieces with all the strength of my fingers. The wax soon yielded to my vigorous treatment and grew warm, for I had the rays of my lord the sun to help me. I took each of my men in turn and plugged their ears with it. They then made me a prisoner on my own ship, by binding me hand and foot, standing me up by the step of the mast, and tying the rope's ends to the mast itself. So in this passage of the Odyssey, Odysseus is traveling on the seas with his sailors, and they know that they're about to pass an island that is full of sirens, that are sort of the killers of men. They are mythological creatures that attract men, but the way that they attract men is with their call, with the songs that they make, the sound of their voices. And so Odysseus, knowing this, cuts up all these pieces of wax, shoves all those pieces of wax into the ears of his sailors, and thus they are not attracted to the island. But Odysseus has his men tie him to the mast so that he can hear the sirens' call. Okay, so now with this done, they sat down once more and struck the grey water with their oars. We made good progress, and had just come within call of the shore, when the sirens became aware that a ship was swiftly bearing down upon them, and broke into their liquid song. "Draw near," they sang, "illustrious Odysseus, flower of Achaean chivalry, and bring your ship to rest so that you may hear our voices. No seaman ever sailed his black ship past this spot without listening to the sweet tones that flow from our lips." The lovely voices came to me across the water, and my heart was filled with such a longing to listen that with a nod and a frown I signed to my men to set me free. So, of course, Odysseus knows that if he goes to the sirens, he will be killed, but he wants to hear their song all the same. Just like men, they want something that they know that they shouldn't have. Which is the case with sirens. Okay, so now jumping back to Cleopatra. Here we go. So Cleopatra has arrived in Caesar's palace, unfurled from the rug. This is, of course, a famous story that's been told a million times, but Robert Greene in this book tells it in a different way that I think is just absolutely mesmerizing. Okay, here we go. Everyone was dazzled at the sight of the beautiful young queen, only 21 at the time, appearing before them suddenly as if in a dream. They were astounded at her daring and theatricality, smuggling into the harbor at night with only one man to protect her, risking everything on a bold move. No one was more enchanted than Caesar. According to the Roman writer Dio Cassius, Cleopatra was in the prime of life. She had a delightful voice, which could not fail to cast a spell over all who heard it. Such was the charm of her person and her speech that they drew the coldest and most determined misogynists into her toils. Caesar was spellbound as soon as he set eyes on her, and she opened her mouth to speak. That same evening, Cleopatra became Caesar's lover. Okay, so really quick, I was wrong when I said Cleopatra was 18 at the time. According to the text, she was 21 at the time. So yeah, she's basically seduced Caesar. And she's using her feminine seduction for a massive, national geostrategic reason. And this is the type of salacious information that we never get about ancient Egyptians, but we get it about Cleopatra because this is Roman times, this is, Greco-Roman times. So this type of information can be, romanticized, recorded, spoken of, retold, written down. And you just don't get that with any of the older stuff in ancient Egyptian history. It's totally dry, interpreting the faces of statues and stuff like that. But with Cleopatra, we have a lot of warmth, we have a lot more to go on. Caesar had had numerous mistresses before to divert him from the rigors of his campaigns, but he had always disposed of them quickly to return to what really thrilled him: political intrigue, the challenges of warfare, the Roman theater. Caesar had seen women try anything to keep him under their spell. Yet nothing prepared him for Cleopatra. One night she would tell him how together they could revive the glory of Alexander the Great and rule the world like gods. The next morning she would entertain him dressed as the goddess Isis, surrounded by the opulence of her court. Cleopatra initiated Caesar into the most decadent revelries, presenting herself as the incarnation of the Egyptian exotic. Caesar had never encountered anything like Cleopatra before. Caesar is a very powerful man and is exposed to all of the finest ladies of Roman society. So the fact that Cleopatra is able to impress him already is just obviously astonishing. But one thing that really blows my mind here, one night she would tell him how together they could revive the glory of Alexander the Great and rule the world like gods. So, Alexander the Great, 300 years earlier, nearly conquered the entire planet, or, the entire known world, not the entire planet, but the entire known world. And if he had succeeded, and if he had lived a long life, and if he had had a successful son who could take over and conduct himself the way that Alexander did at a young age, then it would have been conceivable that during the time of Alexander you could have had something like a 60 to 90 year period of vast, centralized, territorial, and cultural control in which, one man, Alexander, followed by his son, forget the son of Alexander's name, but with such a long period of time under such centralized control, it's conceivable that the entire fabric of the human world could have been permanently altered to create perhaps something like a proto-Roman Empire that actually lasted for a long time. Something that takes control of Europe and the Mediterranean, North Africa and the Middle East, and really holds all this territory and basically wipes away all the factions, all the sub-factions, all the small groups, and really homogenizes culture, language, writing, math, science, thinking, philosophy, and obviously unification also comes at the expense of smaller groups, but it's always been a sort of dreamy idea of a vast, empire that, that is what the dream of Rome sort of is, right? This is the big, endless empire that could really unify things, and it did for a while. That was sort of a crossroads, a turning point. The death of Alexander in 323 BC is kind of like this unfortunate, I think a lot of people, especially during Cleopatra's time, would have viewed it as unfortunate that that Alexander failed, basically, because he was assassinated or killed or died of illness in Babylon. He got sick or he was poisoned, it's unclear. But if he had lived, things would have been very different. And honestly, I think in terms of state formation and unification of humans, it could have been a good thing, maybe. It was done with the sword, so it was a bit violent and bloody, but that is how things were back then. And that's a crossroads in history, like an alternate history scenario turning point. That's the word I was looking for. It's a turning point. And the same thing is true of Cleopatra and Caesar and Mark Antony in the story that I'm reading to you now. That was another turning point. Cleopatra's son that she had with Caesar could have been the son who mounted the world, like in Game of Thrones, when Daenerys Targaryen has a child with that horse lord, Khal Drogo, and their son is going to mount the world. It's a little bit similar to that. I almost feel like George R.R. Martin was kind of copying real history there. But then it was a tragedy that was not to be, because the son was killed and the husband was killed and everything went to shit. But it's a turning point in history that we look back on. I think that these are the two biggest turning points in history that people like to look back on and kind of game it out. And there's alt history books that are written about it, and it's a whole thing. Okay, Cleopatra initiated Caesar in the most decadent revelries, presenting herself as the incarnation of the Egyptian exotic. His life with her was a constant game, as challenging as warfare. For the moment he felt secure with her, she would suddenly turn cold or angry, and he would have to find a way to regain her favor. So yeah, Cleopatra, she knows how to play hot and cold, which is another one of these mind games that's outlined in Robert Greene's book. He doesn't tell you to do it, but he outlines it as a method of seduction. Remember, the book is called The Art of Seduction. playing hot and cold. That's like one of the strategies. The weeks went by. Caesar got rid of all Cleopatra's rivals and found excuses to stay in Egypt. So literally, Caesar just immediately does the bidding of this woman that he just met and gets completely distracted from what he was originally doing, which is, the project of becoming the dictator. At one point, she led him on a lavish historical expedition down the Nile in a boat of unimaginable splendor, towering 54 feet out of the water, including several terraced levels and a pillared temple to the god Dionysus. Caesar became one of the few Romans to gaze on the pyramids. It says few Romans to gaze on the pyramids, but there's actually many, comparatively not that many, but there were many, many, many Romans who visited Egypt and the pyramids, and we know that because they left graffiti everywhere. And when I was in Egypt a few months ago, there was Roman graffiti everywhere. And while Caesar stayed long in Egypt, away from his throne in Rome, all kinds of turmoil erupted throughout the Roman Empire. So I think this sort of speaks to the role of the siren. Remember, the island of the Sirens described in the Odyssey is built on the bones of the men who have tried to reach the Sirens. Cleopatra doesn't care that she's destroying the Roman Empire. She doesn't really care about the Roman Empire at all. She cares about herself. She cares about her political future. She cares about the continuation of her dynasty. She cares about, supposedly cares about her country, Egypt, although I find that debatable, but whatever. So Rome is just a distant thing for her, and this man is doing things for her. And from Caesar's perspective, he's totally entranced. He's letting things go. He doesn't care about all these things that he cared about just minutes ago, or days ago. Just go by the wayside. Okay, we're going to jump forward to the assassination of Julius Caesar. When Caesar was murdered in 44 BC, he was succeeded by a triumvirate of rulers, including Mark Antony, a brave soldier who loved pleasure and spectacle and fancied himself a kind of Roman Dionysus. A few years later, while Antony was in Syria, Cleopatra invited him to come meet her in the Egyptian town of Tarsus. There, once she had made him wait for her, her appearance was as startling in its way as her first before Caesar. A magnificent gold barge with purple sails appeared on the river Cydnus. The oarsmen rowed to the accompaniment of ethereal music. All around the boat were beautiful young girls dressed as nymphs and mythological figures. Cleopatra sat on deck, surrounded and fanned by cupids, and posed as the goddess Aphrodite, whose name the crowd chanted enthusiastically. Like all of Cleopatra's victims, Antony felt mixed emotions. The exotic pleasures she offered were hard to resist, but he also wanted to tame her. To defeat this proud and illustrious woman would prove his greatness. And so he stayed, and like Caesar, fell slowly under her spell. She indulged him in all of his weaknesses: gambling, raucous parties, elaborate rituals, lavish spectacles. To get him to come back to Rome, Octavius, another member of the Roman triumvirate, and Octavius obviously is going to become Augustus. Octavius is the one who's going to kill, or have killed, or would have killed Cleopatra if she hadn't have committed suicide. I believe he kills Cleopatra's son, I forget. But Octavius is, eventually the enemy of Antony and Cleopatra. To get him to come back to Rome, Octavius, who at this point in time is another Roman general, a friend of Mark Antony, offers Mark Antony a new wife, Octavius's own sister, Octavia, one of the most beautiful women in Rome. Known for her virtue and goodness, she could surely keep Antony away from the Egyptian whore. The ploy worked for a while, but Antony was unable to forget Cleopatra, and after 3 years he went back to her. This time it was for good. He had, in essence, become Cleopatra's slave, granting her immense powers, adopting Egyptian dress and customs, and renouncing the ways of Rome. These men are just falling under her spell. Okay, only one real image of Cleopatra survives. A barely visible profile on a coin, which you can see here. Obviously, we have lots of other images that are much newer, for instance, from the Elizabeth Taylor film, or pieces of kind of like concept art, movie posters, etc. But obviously these are modern things. Only one visible image survives. Profile on this coin that you can see here. But we do have numerous written descriptions. She had a long, thin face and a somewhat pointed nose. Her dominant features were her wonderfully large eyes. Her seductive power, however, did not lie in her looks. Indeed, many among the women of Alexandria were considered more beautiful than she. What she did have above all other women was the ability to distract a man. In reality, Cleopatra was physically unexceptional and had no political power, yet both Caesar and Antony, brave and clever men, saw none of this. What they saw was a woman who constantly transformed herself before their eyes, a one-woman spectacle. Her dress and makeup changed from day to day, but always gave her a heightened, goddess-like appearance. Her voice, which all writers talk of, was lilting and intoxicating. Her words could be banal enough, but were spoken so sweetly that listeners would find themselves remembering not what she said, but how she said it. Cleopatra provided constant variety. Tributes, mock battles, expeditions. Everything had a touch of drama and was accomplished with great energy. By the time your head lay on the pillow beside her, your mind was spinning with images and dreams, and just when you thought you had this fluid, larger-than-life woman, just when you thought she was in your grasp, she would turn distant or angry, playing hot and cold, making it clear that everything was on her terms. You never possessed Cleopatra. You worshipped her. In this way, a woman who had been exiled and destined for an early death by her brother and husband managed to turn it all around and rule Egypt for close to 20 years. It actually was sort of a disastrous ending to the 3,000 years of Egyptian history, that it should all end with this one wild woman. But I think that it's such a bombastic end to such a, I hate to say it, but Egyptian history can be rather dry. So we get a very bombastic ending to a very dry, archaeological story. It ends with the most seductive woman perhaps of all times. So I think that that's pretty amazing. And I think we're going to end the podcast in a second, but I will read the last paragraph. Let's see what Robert Greene has to tell us. From Cleopatra, we learn that it is not beauty that makes a siren, but rather a theatrical streak that allows a woman to embody a man's fantasies. A man grows bored with a woman, no matter how beautiful. He yearns for different pleasures and for adventure. All a woman needs to do to turn this around is to create the illusion that she offers such variety and adventure. A man is easily deceived by appearances. Otherwise, why would women wear makeup? He has a weakness for the visual. So Robert Greene tells us that if you create the physical presence of a siren, the heightened sexual allure mixed with, the regal and the theatrical, this can trap the man. A man cannot grow bored with you, yet he cannot discard you. And finally, his final piece of advice: keep up the distractions and never let him see who you really are. So this is not the best advice for women, but this book is fascinating because it is... and then the last line, he will follow you until he drowns. It's like, I don't know who's supposed to be reading this advice. I hope there's no women reading this advice. But luckily, my channel is like 99% men, apparently, if you look at the data. So, okay, so that's been the first episode of the Papyrus Pundit podcast. We're almost 30 minutes in length here. I'm going to cut it short. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please go ahead and do so. Hit the like button, notification bell, leave me a comment. I love you guys. I'm almost to 1,000 subscribers now. My next episode, I'm going to be, hopefully, that I post, my next real episode will be visiting some Egyptian tomb robbers, modern Egyptian tomb robbers, at a undisclosed location to see their dig site where they are digging illegally for treasure. These are criminals who in the daytime dig for the government, for the archaeologists. They are paid diggers. and then they moonlight as grave diggers. They dig holes in the ground on the west bank of the Nile, searching for treasure and the like. And, it's a pretty harsh prison sentence if you're caught. But then again, the government is very corrupt. The government gets its take. The government is in on it. Everything in Egypt is super corrupt in modern times. And on my visit to Egypt, I got to see these things, and it was wonderful. So hopefully that'll be the next big video post that I make. And I will see you guys next time. Not sure when I'm going to do another podcast, unfortunately, because this format I'm not too sure about. I'm just learning how to do this. Subscribe. Love you. Bye-bye.